The bullet's whisper past her temple was so close that Rosalind felt the heat of its passage. And in that split second between life and death, she understood with crystalline clarity that the comfortable illusions of safety she had built around herself were crumbling like autumn leaves in a prairie fire. The copper taste of terror flooded her mouth as lightning split the Wyoming sky, and Montgomery Pike's voice cut through the storm with the casual cruelty of a man who had never doubted his power to take whatever he desired. "This is how I die," she thought, pressed against weathered barn planks while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Not in some grand battle or noble sacrifice, but hunted like an animal because I dared to claim what's rightfully mine. Come out, girl. This barn won't protect you forever, and my patience ain't what it used to be. The trading post at Wind River Ford, her inheritance, her future, her only claim to independence, in a territory that showed women precious little mercy, might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her now. Pike's men had her surrounded, outgunned, and trapped like a rabbit in a snare that had been months in the making. "Easy now." Chayton murmured, his voice carrying the steady calm of a Lakota warrior who had faced cavalry charges and grizzly bears with equal composure. At 28, the scout bore weathered features that spoke of hard living under an unforgiving sun, but his obsidian gaze held depths of gentleness that made her pulse quicken despite their desperate circumstances. "When I move, you follow. Trust me." Trust. Such a simple word for something that could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise or bleeding out in the mud of a nameless barn. She had trusted him once before, 10 years past, when he had pulled her half-drowned body from the spring floods of this same river. The memory flickered through her mind, like heat lightning, a frightened 8-year-old clinging to a wagon wheel, while icy water tried to drag her down to join her murdered family. Then strong hands lifting her to safety, beside a campfire that seemed bright as heaven itself, and kind amber-flecked eyes that promised protection from the chaos that had consumed her world. "I pulled you from the water once," he had said earlier that evening when she had found him outside Murphy's livery and proposed the marriage that might save her life. "Reckon I can do it again if need be." Thunder crashed overhead as Pike's foreman, barbed wire Bill Hutchins, called from the shadows beyond the barn door. His voice carried the gravelly rasp of a man who'd had his throat cut by a Cheyenne tomahawk and lived to tell about it. "Boss, this is taking too dang long. Too dangy. Why don't we smoke 'em out, and this old tinderbox would burn real pretty in all this wind." "Patience, William. The girl's got sand, but she ain't stupid. She knows when the deck's stacked against her." But Rosalind had learned that surrender meant worse than death for women who possessed what powerful men coveted: the water rights to Wind River Ford, inherited from Jean-Baptiste Tremblay, who had raised her as his own daughter after Chayton delivered her to his trading post, controlled irrigation for half the valley. In a drought year, those rights were worth killing for, and Pike had already proven his willingness to spill blood for profit. The French trapper's death 3 months past had seemed natural fever that turned to pneumonia in the space of a week. But now, with Pike's men surrounding her like wolves around wounded prey, she wondered if that fever had been helped along by something more sinister than bad air and hard living. The first rifle shot shattered the night stillness, followed by the angry whine of lead passing inches from her auburn hair. Without hesitation, Chayton grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the barn's rear exit, while splinters exploded around them like wooden hornets. "Move!" He commanded, his Spencer carbine booming twice as muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions outside. The bay horse beside them snorted and reared iron shoes, striking sparks from the stone floor as bullets chewed through the ancient timber walls. They burst into the storm's full fury, immediately seeking cover behind an overturned wagon, as Pike's men closed their trap with military precision. Rosalind's derringer cracked once the small gun bucking in her grip as she targeted a shadow moving along the barn's eastern wall. The range was poor and visibility worse, but satisfaction flooded through her when the shadow stumbled and fell cursing into a pile of broken harness. "Sweet blazes," she whispered, surprised by her own accuracy under such dire circumstances. "Good shot." Chayton approved his voice, carrying pride along with urgent necessity. "Now let's see if we can make it to the creek before they reorganize." They sprinted across open ground, while bullets whined around them like angry wasps, their boots splashing through puddles that reflected the lightning's glare in jagged fragments. Behind them, Pike's voice roared orders to his men, coordinating pursuit with the efficiency of a former cavalry officer who had learned his trade fighting Sioux and Cheyenne during the recent Indian troubles. The creek bank offered momentary sanctuary, its eroded sides providing concealment from the rifles above, while rushing water masked the sound of their movements. But within minutes, Pike's dragnet would tighten around them, turning their refuge into a killing ground, where superior numbers would overwhelm courage and desperation. "This way," Chayton whispered, leading her upstream toward a culvert that might offer passage beneath the main trail. The opening was barely large enough for their bodies, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through mud and debris, while frigid water soaked through their clothes and chilled them to the bone. The tunnel stretched endlessly through sucking mud that grabbed at their hands and knees, while overhead the storm continued its assault on the prairie with sheets of precipitation that turned every surface into treacherous footing. Rosalind's skirts tangled around her legs, and more than once she had to bite back curses that would have made a mule skinner blush. They emerged 50 yards from their pursuers, gasping and shivering in the pre-dawn darkness, while search lanterns flickered through the trees behind them. Ahead lay open prairie that offered speed but no concealment from long-range rifles. Behind them, Pike's net was drawing closed with mathematical precision. But Chayton's knowledge of the territory proved invaluable. Leading her through a maze of buffalo wallows and dry creek beds, he managed to keep them hidden from pursuit while working their way toward a rocky outcrop that offered both concealment and defensible positions. "Here," he whispered, guiding her into a shallow cave formed by fallen boulders. The space was barely large enough for 2 people, but it was dry and hidden from casual observation. "We rest here until full daylight, then make our run for the meeting place." The enforced intimacy of their hiding place brought them closer together than the practical arrangement of their hasty marriage had allowed. Pressed against his solid warmth in the darkness, Rosalind became acutely aware of the man who had agreed to protect her, and the steady rhythm of his breathing and the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his buckskin shirt and the careful way he positioned himself to shield her from the cave's rough walls. "You're shivering," he observed quietly, his breath warm against her ear as he adjusted his position to share what little body heat their circumstances allowed. "Just cold," she replied, though they both knew it was more than that. The terror of their flight was giving way to exhaustion and the kind of bone-deep chill that came from being soaked to the skin in weather that could kill the unprepared. Without speaking, Chayton removed his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, the gesture so natural and protective that she felt tears sting her eyes. No one had cared for her comfort since Jean-Baptiste's death, and the simple kindness of the act threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "Tell me something," she whispered, needing distraction from the sound of searchers calling to each other in the distance. "Something that has nothing to do with Pike or water rights or any of this ugliness." He was quiet for so long that she thought he hadn't heard her. But then his voice came softly through the darkness, carrying memories that seemed to transform their cramped hiding place into something larger and more peaceful. "When I was about Tasunki's age, my grandfather took me on my first memories quest up in the Bighorn Mountains. We climbed for 2 days to reach a sacred place where the ancestors had left spirit signs in the rocks. Old Man made me fast for 3 days, drinking only water and breathing the thin air while I waited for the spirits to show me my path in life. His voice carried a quality she had never heard before, not the practical tone of a frontier scout or the controlled calm of a warrior, but something deeper and more personal that spoke of beliefs and traditions that went back generations before white men had ever seen the Wyoming Territory. On the third night, I saw her a white eagle circling overhead, even though there was no moon, and eagles don't fly in darkness. She spoke to me in the old language, told me that my path would be to stand between two worlds, helping people cross from danger to safety, like a bridge over swift water. Rosalind found herself holding her breath, not wanting to break the spell of his storytelling or the trust he was showing by sharing something so intimate and sacred. Thought it meant I'd be guiding wagon trains or scouting for the cavalry. He continued, his voice carrying wry amusement at his younger self's limited understanding. Never occurred to me that the crossing might be from one kind of life to another, or that the people I'd help might include a green-eyed girl who'd grown up to be the strongest woman I've ever known. The words hung between them in the darkness, carrying weight that went far beyond simple comfort or distraction. In the space of a few sentences, he had revealed not just his spiritual beliefs, but his growing feelings for her, and the knowledge sent warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with his jacket around her shoulders. "Strongest," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "I don't feel strong. I feel scared and alone, and completely out of my depth. Being scared doesn't make you weak." He replied, his hand finding hers in the darkness and holding it with gentle strength. "It makes you human. What makes you strong is that you keep going. Despite the fear, keep fighting for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you." His thumb traced across her knuckles with infinite tenderness, and she realized that somewhere between the barn and this hidden cave, their relationship had shifted from practical alliance to something much deeper and more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. They stayed in the cave until the storm passed, and the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the rocks that concealed their hiding place. The hours of enforced closeness had changed something fundamental between them, building intimacy through shared vulnerability and whispered conversations that revealed the people they were beneath the roles they played. When they finally emerged, both understood that they were no longer just allies bound by legal documents and mutual necessity. They were partners in the truest sense, people who had seen each other at their most frightened and vulnerable and chosen to trust completely, despite the risks such trust entailed. The journey to their meeting point with Tasunke took them through country that grew more beautiful and more dangerous with each mile. The storm had washed the air clean, leaving behind skies so blue they seemed to stretch into infinity, and mountains that rose like monuments to some greater power's artistry. But it had also left behind mud that could trap horses and swollen streams that could sweep away anyone foolish enough to attempt crossing at the wrong place. They found Tasunke waiting in a grove of cottonwoods near what had once been a cavalry outpost, now nothing more than the charred remains of buildings and the crumbling stone foundation of a fort that had been abandoned when the Indian Wars moved to other theaters. The young warrior's face showed relief at seeing them alive, but also anxiety about what he had observed during his solitary vigil. "Uncle," he said in rapid Lakota before switching to English for Rosalind's benefit, "Pike's men are everywhere. They spread out during the storm, making camp at every water source and trail junction within 20 miles. The fat man's got more resources than we figured." "How many?" Chayton asked, studying the surrounding terrain with the eye of someone who had learned to read landscape for tactical advantages and hidden dangers. 40, maybe 50. Some wearing U.S. Marshal badges, others dressed like federal agents. But I watch them make camp and they ain't following any kind of military discipline. These are hired guns playing dress up, not real lawmen." The information was both encouraging and terrifying. If Pike was using counterfeit badges and impersonating federal authority, it meant his corruption ran deeper than they had imagined. But it also meant that real federal agents might not be compromised, and that evidence of impersonation could bring down his entire criminal enterprise. There's more. Tasunki continued, his young face troubled by what he had witnessed. I got close enough to their main camp to hear Pike talking to his lieutenants. They ain't just hunting us for the water rights anymore. Pike's got it in his head that Uncle knows something that could destroy him completely, something that goes back to the cavalry days. Rosalind felt Chayton tense beside her, and she remembered the story he had shared about saving Pike's life during the Indian Wars. Whatever secrets lay in that shared past, they were important enough to drive Pike to extraordinary measures to keep them buried. Did you hear anything specific? She asked, understanding that their survival might depend on knowing exactly what they were up against. Bits and pieces. Something about Crazy Woman Creek and a patrol that went wrong. Pike kept saying he couldn't let Uncle live to testify about what really happened that day, that his whole career would be ruined if the truth came out. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in ways that painted an even uglier picture of Pike's character. The cattle baron wasn't just a criminal who used violence to steal water rights, he was a coward who had built his entire life on a lie. And he would kill anyone who threatened to expose that foundational deception. But there was no time to delve deeper into Pike's psychological motivations. Tasunki's intelligence had revealed the scope of the forces arrayed against them, and they needed to adapt their plans accordingly. The canyon route's still our best option. Chayton decided after studying the rough map Tasunki had drawn in the dirt. If we can reach Devil's Canyon before they reorganize, we might be able to lose them in country where numbers don't matter as much as knowledge of the terrain. And if we can't? Rosalind asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Then we make our stand in ground of our own choosing and hope that courage counts for more than superior firepower. They mounted their horses and began the most dangerous part of their journey, riding through country, where every ridge might conceal an ambush and every trail junction might be guarded by Pike's men. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful in the morning light, but it was also filled with death waiting for the unwary or unlucky. The first ambush was sprung at Willow Creek, where the trail narrowed between steep banks and offered no alternative routes for travelers heading toward the high country. Hidden riflemen opened fire from both sides of the crossing, their bullets kicking up geysers of muddy water as the three riders plunged into the current. Chayton's bay stumbled on slick stones, nearly going down before recovering its footing and lunging toward the far bank. A bullet burned across the animal's neck, drawing blood, but missing vital arteries as they scrambled up the opposite slope with hooves slipping on wet clay. But it was Tasunki's paint gelding that took the worst of it. A lucky shot from a concealed marksman shattered the horse's front leg just above the fetlock, sending mount and rider tumbling into the rocky shallows where the creek bent around a fallen pine. The young warrior rolled clear of thrashing hooves with reflexes that spoke of long training, but blood streamed from a gash on his forehead where he had struck a boulder during the fall. "Leave me," he called, struggling to his feet, while Pike's men closed in from multiple directions, their rifles glinting wetly in the weak sunlight. "Take the woman and ride hard for the high country." "Like blazes," Chayton replied, wheeling his bay back toward the creek, while his Spencer spoke repeatedly, forcing the attackers to seek cover among the rocks and deadfall. "Family don't abandon family, and your family now, whether you like it or not." Rosalind didn't hesitate. Dismounting from her nervous mare, she grabbed Tasunki's arm and helped him stumble toward higher ground while bullets chipped stone around them like deadly hail. His weight was considerable for someone barely out of boyhood, but desperation gave her strength as they reached Chayton's position. "Can you ride double?" she asked, studying his pale features for signs of serious injury while trying to ignore the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Better than I can walk," he replied with a pained grin that reminded her powerfully of his uncle's stoic courage. "But my horse is done for, and we're one mount short against 20 riders." The bay now carried 2 riders, slowing their pace and making them more vulnerable to pursuit. But Tasunke's knowledge of hidden trails through the Badlands might compensate for their reduced speed if they could stay ahead of Pike's dragnet long enough to reach country where numbers mattered less than skill and intimate knowledge of the terrain. As they climbed into the broken landscape where ancient floods had carved fantastic formations from sandstone that glowed red and gold in the morning light, Tasunke shared intelligence that revealed just how methodically Pike had planned their destruction. "While I was waiting for you at the old fort," he said, his voice tight with pain from his head injury, "I watched their patrols moving through the country. They're not just chasing us, they're herding us toward specific locations where they've got more men waiting in ambush." "Which locations?" Chayton asked, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications of such careful preparation. "The bridge at Copper Creek, the narrows at Snake River Canyon, and the mine workings at Gunpowder Gulch. All places where the terrain favors attackers over people trying to get through." The information forced them to reconsider their route entirely. Every obvious path toward safety had been anticipated and prepared for turning their flight into a game, where Pike held most of the cards and controlled most of the board. But Chayton's years of scouting had taught him to think like the people he tracked, to anticipate their movements and find the routes they wouldn't expect. If Pike was herding them toward prepared killing grounds, then their best hope lay in refusing to be herded. "We go through Gunpowder Gulch," he decided, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had made similar life-or-death decisions many times before. But not the way they expect. They climbed steadily into broken terrain, where wind-carved sandstone created a maze of canyons and mesas that could conceal an army or become a tomb for the unwary. Behind them, pursuit continued with relentless determination, as Pike's hired guns followed their trail through increasingly hostile territory. "There's something you should know," Tasunke said quietly, as they paused on a ridge to study the country ahead. "About Pike and my uncle. They got history that goes back to the cavalry wars." Rosalind felt her stomach clench with sudden apprehension. "What kind of history?" "Uncle was scouting for the Bluecoats back in '68 during the worst of the fighting around Fort Phil Kearny. Pike was a lieutenant, then commanding a patrol that got cut off by Red Cloud's warriors near Crazy Woman Creek." The young warrior's voice carried undertones that suggested this story didn't have a happy ending, and Rosalind found herself dreading whatever revelation was coming next. "Uncle saved Pike's life that day, pulled him out of a creek bottom where he'd been left for dead after his horse went down. Carried him back to the fort through 20 miles of hostile territory, fighting off war parties all the way. Then why does Pike want to kill him now?" Tasunke's expression grew darker, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of family shame that had been carried for years without resolution. "Because Pike claimed credit for the patrol's survival. Told the colonel he'd led his men out of the trap through superior tactics and personal courage. Got himself a promotion and a commendation while Uncle got dismissed from the scouts for excessive fraternization with hostile elements. The betrayal was staggering in its casual cruelty, and Rosalind began to understand some of the pain she had glimpsed in Chayton's eyes. He had saved Pike's life and career, only to be cast aside when his beneficiary decided that a half-breed scout's testimony might complicate the heroic narrative that advanced his military ambitions. "Does Chayton know you told me?" "No, ma'am. But he will once we get out of this scrape. Uncle's not one to dwell on past hurts, but some wounds never quite heal proper." They resumed their flight through country that grew more treacherous with each mile, following deer paths and old Indian trails that required intimate knowledge of the terrain to navigate safely. But the sound of pursuit never faded entirely, and Pike's voice could occasionally be heard echoing through the canyons as he coordinated his men's efforts to close the trap. The approach to Gunpowder Gulch revealed the true scope of Pike's preparations. The canyon mouth was guarded by at least a dozen riflemen concealed among the rocks, while more men had taken positions on the rim where they could fire down into the narrow passage below. It was a perfect killing ground, designed to eliminate anyone foolish enough to attempt passage through the gulch. But Chayton had studied the survey maps that detailed the area's geology, and he knew about features that wouldn't be visible to casual observation. The old silver mine that gave the gulch its name was just one part of a larger complex of workings that honeycombed the entire mountain, offering possibilities that Pike's men might not have considered. "Oak, there," he whispered, indicating a barely visible opening in the cliff face above the main canyon floor. Secondary workings from the original mining operation. If the maps were accurate, those tunnels connect to the main shaft system and maybe even provide alternate routes through the mountain. Rosalind studied the opening with growing apprehension. It was high enough above the canyon floor that reaching it would require exposed climbing while under fire from multiple positions. Even if they managed to gain access to the mine workings, there was no guarantee the tunnels would provide escape rather than just a more elaborate tomb. But the alternative was certain death in the crossfire that Pike had prepared, and any chance was better than no chance at all. The second ambush came at Gunpowder Gulch, where the ruins of an abandoned silver mine offered both shelter and danger. Chayton spotted the trap before they rode into it, fresh horse droppings near the mine entrance, and the glint of sunlight on rifle barrels among the rusted mining equipment. "Back!" he called, raining hard as the first shots rang out from concealment. They're dug in like ticks on a hound. But retreat was impossible. Pike himself appeared on the trail behind them, leading a dozen mounted men who had followed their tracks through the muddy ground with the persistence of bloodhounds on a hot scent. The cattle baron sat his black gelding with the arrogance of a man who believed victory was assured. His silver mustache and expensive coat unable to disguise the predator's gleam in his pale blue eyes. "End of the trail, girl," Pike called, his voice echoing off the canyon walls with false joviality. "No more running, no more hiding. Time to face reality and accept what's inevitable." They were trapped between two forces, with superior numbers and better positions, caught in a crossfire that would cut them down the moment they showed themselves. The mining ruins offered the only possibility of escape shaft openings that led deep into the mountain tunnel systems that could provide sanctuary or become their tomb, depending on how they were used. "The main shaft," Chayton whispered, indicating a dark opening in the cliff face 50 yards above their position. "According to the survey maps I studied when the territory was planning railroad routes, it connects to a whole network of workings. Multiple levels cross tunnels, maybe even other ways out. Or maybe we get lost in there and die slow," Rosalind replied, but her voice carried resignation rather than complaint. They had no choice but to find out. They made their desperate dash under heavy fire, abandoning the horses and carrying only essential weapons and supplies. Pike's bullets followed them into the mountain's mouth, sparking off stone walls and filling the tunnel with a whine of ricochets that could kill as easily as direct hits. The shaft stretched into the mountain's heart like the throat of some primordial beast swallowing their lamplight, and echoing with the drip of water from unseen heights. Ancient timbers groaned under the weight of stone above, and the air grew thin as they descended along passages that hadn't seen human traffic in decades. But they weren't alone in the mountain's depths. The sound of voices echoed through the tunnels. Pike's men had followed them underground, and they were spreading out to conduct a methodical search that would eventually flush their quarry from whatever hiding place they might find. "Listen," Chayton whispered, pressing his ear to the tunnel wall. "At least 6 men, maybe 8. They're splitting up to cover more ground." The realization that they were being hunted through the mine's labyrinthine passages turned their flight into a deadly game of cat and mouse. Pike's men had lanterns and superior numbers, but Chayton had studied the survey maps that detailed the mine's layout, and he began to use that knowledge to turn the hunters into the hunted. "This way," he whispered, leading them through a narrow crack in the wall that opened into a natural cavern carved by underground water. The space was vast enough to swallow their lamplight, with formations that sparkled like jewels in the flickering glow. But more importantly, the cavern connected to multiple passages that led in different directions through the mountain. If they could separate Pike's men and deal with them individually, they might have a chance of survival. The plan required splitting up something that went against every instinct of people who had learned to depend on each other for survival. But the alternative was being cornered and slaughtered like animals in a trap. "There's a passage that leads to the upper workings," Chayton said quietly, studying the rough map he had sketched from memory of the survey documents. "If we can get 2 or 3 of Pike's men to follow us up there, we might be able to use the unstable ground to our advantage." He was thinking of the section of tunnel he remembered from the geological reports, an area where water seepage had weakened the support timbers and made the ceiling dangerously unstable. A few well-placed shots might bring down enough rock to trap or eliminate their pursuers. "I'll take point," Rosalind said, surprising both men with her volunteering for the most dangerous position. "I'm lighter, less likely to trigger a collapse accidentally, and my derringer will be more useful at close range anyway." "Like hell," Chayton replied immediately. "You're not trained for this kind of—" "Neither are you." She interrupted, her voice carrying quiet determination. "You're a scout and a warrior, not a miner. But I spent 5 years helping Jean-Baptiste survey mineral claims throughout the territory. I know unstable ground when I see it." The logic was sound, even if it terrified him to think of her taking such risks. They were all operating outside their areas of expertise, gambling their lives on knowledge that might be incomplete or outdated. "Tasunke, you take the passage that leads downward," Chayton instructed quietly. "Make noise, draw at least 2 of them after you then lose them in the flooded workings. The water's deep enough down there to hide your movement, and they'll be fighting current as well as darkness." "What if we get separated?" the young warrior asked, his voice betraying the fear he was trying to suppress. "Then we meet at the waterfall we saw on the way in. If one of us doesn't make it." He paused, his throat tightening with emotion he couldn't afford to show. "If one of us doesn't make it, the others keep going. Don't stop, don't look back. Don't let Pike win by sacrificing ourselves for sentiment." But even as he spoke the words, all 3 of them understood that they would never abandon each other, no matter what the cost might be. The hunt through the mine's depths began with careful preparation. Using his knowledge of the tunnel system, Chayton identified a section where the ceiling was held up by rotted timbers over a deep pit that had been carved by underground water. The geological surveys had noted the area as particularly unstable, likely to collapse if subjected to any significant vibration or impact. They prepared their trap with the methodical thoroughness of people who understood that mistakes would be fatal. Rosalind positioned herself where she could fire at the critical support beam with her derringer, while Chayton took a position where his rifle could provide backup if her shots weren't sufficient to trigger the collapse. The bait was simple noise and light, designed to draw Pike's men toward what appeared to be frightened fugitives, making clumsy attempts at concealment. They scattered mining equipment to create the sounds of panicked movement, then retreated to their prepared positions to wait for the trap to be sprung. The first two searchers appeared within minutes, their lantern light dancing off tunnel walls as they followed the obvious trail toward what they believed would be an easy capture. They were Pike's men hired guns who had grown overconfident through easy victories over isolated homesteaders and intimidated witnesses. "There," one of them called, pointing toward the shadow, where Rosalind waited with her small gun steady in her grip. The girls hiding behind them rocks. They rushed forward with the eagerness of predators closing in on wounded prey, never noticing the carefully placed mining equipment or the ominous creaking of ancient timbers above their heads. It wasn't until Rosalind's derringer spoke that they realized they had walked into a trap rather than finding easy victims. Her first shot struck the critical support beam with precision that spoke of extensive practice with firearms, while her second shot completed the work of destruction that brought tons of rock and debris crashing down into the passage. The two gunmen disappeared under the avalanche with barely enough time to scream, their lantern extinguished by falling stone that sealed off the tunnel behind them. The sound of the collapse echoed through the mine workings like thunder, announcing to everyone underground that the hunters had become the hunted in ways they hadn't anticipated. But it also brought the remaining searchers converging on their position with desperate urgency, understanding that their quarry was more dangerous than anticipated. Tasunke's part of the plan proved equally successful, though more harrowing than any of them had expected. The young warrior used his knowledge of traditional hunting techniques to lure two more of Pike's men into the flooded sections of the mine, where deep water and treacherous footing turned pursuit into a nightmare of survival rather than capture. The underground pools were ice-cold and deeper than they appeared from the surface, fed by springs that had been flowing since long before the first miners had tunneled into the mountain. Tasunke's superior swimming ability and knowledge of the water's hidden currents allowed him to move like a ghost through the flooded passages, while his pursuers struggled against current and darkness that sapped their strength and confused their sense of direction. When the young warrior finally emerged from the water to spring his own ambush, his enemies were exhausted and disoriented, easy targets for precise shots that eliminated them without the need for elaborate engineering. But the experience left him shaken in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. "First time I ever killed a man," he thought, as he stared at the bodies floating face down in the black water. "Grandmother always said that taking a life changes you forever, leaves marks on your spirit that never quite fade." But there was no time for philosophical contemplation or spiritual cleansing rituals. Pike's remaining men were closing in, and the sound of approaching voices suggested that reinforcements might be entering the mine from other openings they hadn't known about. The reconvening of their small group took place in the natural cavern where they had first split up, but the reunion was shadowed by the knowledge that they had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. They were no longer just fugitives running from corrupt authority. They were people who had taken lives in defense of their own, and that change would follow them wherever their journey led. "4 down," Chayton reported grimly. "But there are still voices echoing through the passages, and some of them are coming from directions that suggest Pike has more men than we figured. Or he found other ways into the mine." Rosalind added her voice, carrying the strain of recent violence, along with growing exhaustion. "Either way, we need to keep moving before they organize another search." But it was as they prepared to continue their flight through the mountain that Tasunke made a discovery that changed their understanding of what they were facing. Hidden among the rocks near what appeared to be a recent campsite, he found a leather document case that had been dropped or concealed by someone who had been using the mine for purposes that went far beyond mineral extraction. Inside the case were papers that made Rosalind's blood run cold. Official correspondence between Pike and territorial officials, including Governor Alistair Camden himself, detailing a conspiracy that reached far beyond cattle ranching into systematic corruption of territorial government. But it was one particular document that revealed the true scope of what they were fighting, a letter bearing the territorial seal that authorized the use of any means necessary to secure water rights at Wind River Ford, including the elimination of troublesome witnesses who might interfere with legitimate business interests. Sweet Mary and Joseph, she whispered, her hands shaking as she read correspondence that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy against her. We're not just fighting Pike. This goes all the way to the territorial capital. Chayton studied the documents by the flickering light of their lamp, his face growing grimmer with each page he read. The conspiracy was vast, involving not just territorial officials, but federal appointees, railroad interests, and Eastern financiers who saw Wyoming's resources as profit opportunities to be exploited through any means necessary. Campbell's signature, he said quietly, indicating the governor's flowing script at the bottom of several documents. This makes it legal murder, sanctioned by territorial authority. The revelation meant that even if they escaped Pike's immediate threat, they would still face enemies who possessed the full weight of governmental power. Courts, U.S. Marshals, even federal officials might be compromised by the conspiracy that wanted them dead. But it also meant that they now possessed evidence that could expose the entire criminal network if they could survive long enough to present it to honest authorities who still existed somewhere in the system. The confrontation with Pike came suddenly, without warning or preparation. One moment they were studying the documents that revealed the scope of their enemies, and the next, the cattle baron emerged from a side passage with his remaining men. Guns drawn and faces grim with the knowledge that this hunt was nearing its end. "Well, well," Pike said, his voice carrying satisfaction along with barely controlled rage. "The famous water rights heiress and her half-breed protector. You've led us quite a chase through this rat's maze." "Not quite over yet," Chayton replied, positioning himself between Pike and Rosalind while calculating distances and angles in the flickering lamplight. "Oh, but it is," Pike contradicted, his pale eyes gleaming with anticipation. "You see, I know about every passage in this mine, every tunnel, and every way out. I've been using these workings to store supplies and hide activities that the territorial government prefers to keep quiet." That explained how Pike's men had been able to anticipate their movements and set ambushes in places that should have been impossible to predict. The cattle baron had been using the mine as a base of operations for months, maybe years, turning it into a fortress that could hide his criminal activities from territorial authorities. "But what really galls me," Pike continued, his voice rising with anger that had been building for years, "is that you still don't understand what this is really about. This isn't just about water rights or cattle ranching. This is about a half-breed scout who thinks he's better than his betters, who witnessed things he should have kept his mouth shut about." The words hung in the cavern air like smoke from a discharged pistol. And suddenly Rosalind understood that this confrontation had roots that went much deeper than her inheritance from Jean-Baptiste Tremblay. "You remember Crazy Woman Creek, don't you, Chayton?" Pike asked, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was somehow more threatening than shouting. "Remember finding me in that creek, bottom half dead from blood loss and shock? Remember what else you saw there?" Chayton's face had gone stone still, but his eyes burned with memory and long-suppressed anger. "I remember. Do you remember watching me crawl away from my men while they died fighting Red Cloud's warriors? Do you remember seeing me throw away my rifle and hide like a yellow dog while soldiers under my command were being butchered because I was too scared to lead them?" The confession was delivered with the bitter self-hatred of a man who had lived with shame for years, building wealth and power to compensate for the cowardice that had defined his character in the crucible of battle. But it was also delivered with the desperate fury of someone who would kill to prevent that shame from becoming public knowledge. "You saved my life that day." Pike continued, his voice thick with emotion that was part gratitude and part loathing. Carried me back to the fort when you could have left me to die like the coward I was. And for 10 years, I've been waiting for you to use that knowledge against me. Never crossed my mind, Chayton replied quietly. What happened in that creek bottom was between you and your conscience. Liar. Pike's voice cracked like a whip in the enclosed space. You think I don't know about the looks, the whispers, the way decent people treat me when they think I can't see someone talked, and it had to be you. But Rosalind was beginning to understand that Pike's paranoia had created enemies where none existed, that his shame had poisoned his relationships with everyone around him, until he saw betrayal in every shadow and threat in every whisper. You're wrong, she said, stepping into view despite Chayton's attempt to keep her behind him. Nobody cares about what happened 10 years ago, but they'll sure remember what happens here today. Pike's laugh was harsh as winter wind through bare branches. What happens here today is that 3 troublemakers disappear in a mine cave-in, and territorial authorities investigate their tragic accident with appropriate sadness and regret. He raised his pistol toward Rosalind, perhaps thinking to end the matter with a single shot that would eliminate the primary witness to his activities. But he had forgotten that wounded men can be more dangerous than healthy ones, and that love can give people strength beyond their normal limitations. Chayton moved despite his injuries, throwing himself between Pike's gun and its intended target, while his own weapon came up in a draw so smooth it seemed like sleight of hand. The 2 shots came almost simultaneously, echoing through the cavern like thunder in a bottle. Pike's bullet took Chayton in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the stone floor, where his blood began to pool in the lamplight. But his own shot had found its mark, and Pike staggered backward with a hole through his throat that made speech impossible and breathing a struggle. The cattle baron's remaining men hesitated for a crucial moment, unsure whether to continue the fight or retreat, now that their leader was mortally wounded. That hesitation cost them everything, as Tasunke appeared from a side passage, his rifle speaking repeatedly with deadly accuracy. The young warrior had used his knowledge of the mine's layout to work his way behind their enemies, and now he attacked with the fury of someone protecting family. Within minutes, Pike's men were dead or dying victims of carefully aimed shots that left no doubt about the outcome. Pike himself lived long enough to see his empire crumbling around him, long enough to watch blood from his throat wound pool with the blood of the men who had served his criminal ambitions. When death finally claimed him, it was with his pale eyes fixed on Chayton's still form, as if even in dying he couldn't let go of the hatred that had consumed his life. But Chayton wasn't dead, though his breathing was shallow, and his face had gone gray with blood loss. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, but it had done damage that required immediate medical attention if he was going to survive. "Can you move?" Rosalind asked, pressing her hands against the wound to slow the bleeding, while Tasunke searched Pike's men for anything that might help with their escape. "Have to," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Those documents. Have to get them to honest authorities before Pike's associates realize what's happened." They fashioned a crude stretcher from mining equipment and began the difficult journey toward the mine's main entrance, carrying evidence that could reshape territorial government if it reached the right people. But every step was agony for Chayton, and more than once they had to stop while he fought waves of unconsciousness that threatened to claim him. The passage through the mine's upper workings was treacherous, even without the burden of carrying a wounded man. Rotted timbers groaned under the weight of tons of stone above, while poisonous gases from decades of mining operations made every breath a calculated risk. But their knowledge of the tunnel system, gained at such terrible cost, allowed them to navigate hazards that would have claimed less prepared travelers. It was as they finally emerged into daylight through a concealed opening behind a waterfall that they discovered their ordeal wasn't quite over. More riders were approaching, not Pike's men this time, but a column of federal marshals led by a man whose badge caught the afternoon sunlight with legitimate authority. Marshal Leopold Hale dismounted with the deliberate movements of someone who had seen too much frontier violence, his weathered face showing relief at finding them alive, but concern about the condition of the man they were carrying. Mrs. Chayton. He greeted her with formal courtesy that carried undertones of respect. We heard gunfire from the mine workings. Are you injured? Not me, she replied, indicating Chayton's still form. But he needs a doctor, and we have information that can't wait for formal procedures. It was then that one of the federal agents stepped forward, and Rosalind saw a familiar face that made her reassess everything she thought she knew about their recent allies. Beatrice Wells moved with the trained alertness of someone who had been watching for threats, while her eyes held the steady gaze of professional competence rather than civilian concern. But it wasn't just her presence that was shocking. It was the way she moved to check Chayton's pulse with the skilled hands of someone trained in battlefield medicine, and the way she spoke quietly to Marshal Hale in the kind of professional shorthand that suggested long collaboration. Agent Wells has been working undercover for 2 years, Hale explained, noting Rosalind's confusion. Documenting territorial corruption and gathering evidence against Pike's organization. Her reports were instrumental in getting federal authorization for this operation. The revelation was staggering, but somehow unsurprising. It explained Beatrice's presence during crucial moments of their ordeal, her knowledge of territorial politics, and her willingness to risk her life, helping them escape Pike's dragnet. I've been feeding information to federal investigators, Beatrice said, simply showing credentials that identified her as an undercover operative working for the territorial corruption investigation. But we needed witnesses and documentation to make federal charges stick against the higher-level conspirators. Rosalind handed over the document case they had found in the mine, watching as federal agents examined papers that revealed systematic corruption reaching from Wyoming to Washington. The evidence was overwhelming enough to topple territorial governments and expose criminal networks that had operated with impunity for years. This is even bigger than we suspected, Marshal Hale said, as he reviewed correspondence that detailed the conspiracy's scope. Governor Alistair Camden's involved, along with federal appointees and business interests from back east. These documents could reshape territorial government from top to bottom. But it was the personal cost of their victory that weighed most heavily as they made the journey back to Wind River Ford. Chayton's condition remained critical despite Dr. Price's best efforts during the slow trip home. And there were moments when it seemed his injuries might claim him after all their struggles to survive. The trading post had been transformed during their absence, with federal agents using it as a temporary headquarters, while they coordinated the arrests and investigations that would follow Pike's death. But it was still home, still the place where they had found each other and built something worth fighting for. During the long weeks of nursing Chayton back to health, Rosalind had time to reflect on everything that had happened and everything that would follow. The federal investigations were just beginning, and their testimony would be crucial in building cases against the surviving members of Pike's network. It was during this period of recovery and preparation that Marshal Hale brought news that would change the trajectory of their lives once again. The territorial government was being reorganized under federal supervision, and congressional investigators were coming to conduct hearings that would expose the full scope of the corruption they had helped uncover. "You'll need to testify," Hale explained as they sat in the trading post's main room, surrounded by legal documents and federal evidence that painted a picture of systematic criminality. "Your experiences with Pike, the documents you found in the mine, everything you witnessed about territorial corruption." "Adoro, what kind of hearings?" Rosalind asked, though she suspected the answer would complicate their hopes for a quiet life. Congressional hearings with full federal authority to investigate and prosecute territorial crimes. Your testimony could help reshape territorial government and establish legal precedents that protect property rights throughout the West. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. Congressional attention meant that their story would receive national notice, but it also meant making enemies of people who controlled vast resources and possessed long memories for those who crossed them. As autumn deepened and the first snow began to dust the mountains, with white preparations began for the journey to Cheyenne and the hearings that would determine the future of territorial government. Federal marshals arrived to provide security for witnesses, while newspaper reporters began arriving to cover what promised to be the most significant political event in Wyoming's territorial history. The hearings themselves proved to be a masterpiece of legal theater, with federal prosecutors presenting evidence that exposed corruption reaching from local cattle barons to the highest levels of territorial and federal government. But it was Rosalind's testimony that provided the dramatic centerpiece that captured national attention and demonstrated the human cost of systematic corruption. The courtroom was packed with spectators when she took the witness stand. Her simple dress and quiet demeanor contrasting sharply with the legal pomp and political grandstanding that had characterized much of the proceedings. But when she began to speak, describing her experiences with Pike's criminal organization and the conspiracy that had nearly cost their lives, the room fell silent with the kind of attention that recognized genuine courage. Mrs. Chayton, the defense attorney for Governor Alistair Camden, began his cross-examination with the kind of patronizing tone that suggested he expected to intimidate a simple frontier woman. You've made some very serious accusations against respected territorial officials. Do you have any proof beyond your own word? I have this, she replied, simply producing the leather document case that had been found in the mine. Correspondence between your client and Montgomery Pike, detailing plans to eliminate witnesses and seize property through fraudulent legal proceedings. The attorney's confidence began to waver as she methodically presented evidence that had been authenticated by federal investigators, each document revealing another aspect of the criminal conspiracy that had infected territorial government. These could be forgeries, he suggested desperately. Fabricated evidence designed to discredit honest officials who were simply trying to maintain law and order in a difficult territory. Then perhaps you can explain why Governor Alistair Camden's own seal appears on documents authorizing the murder of territorial citizens. Rosalind replied, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made every word carry weight with the jury. Or why financial records show payments from Eastern Railroad interests to accounts controlled by territorial officials who just happened to approve land grants along proposed railroad routes. The cross-examination continued for hours, but with each question, the defense attorney only succeeded in highlighting additional evidence of corruption and criminal conspiracy. Rosalind's careful preparation and natural intelligence allowed her to turn every attack into an opportunity to present more damaging information about the network Pike had served. But it was her final exchange with the defense attorney that provided the dramatic climax the proceedings needed to crystallize public opinion against the forces of corruption. Mrs. Chayton, the lawyer said with desperation, making his voice sharp, you were married to this scout for protection, were you not? A business arrangement rather than a genuine marriage. How do we know this entire story isn't simply an elaborate fraud designed to legitimize an illegal land claim? The question hung in the courtroom air like smoke from a discharged pistol, and Rosalind felt every eye in the room focused on her as she considered her response. This was the moment that would define not just her testimony, but her entire future with Chayton. You're right, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. I did marry Chayton for protection. But what you don't understand is that protection can mean many things. She paused her gaze, finding Chayton among the spectators, seeing in his eyes the same love and trust that had sustained them through their darkest hours. He protected me from Pike's bullets and his hired guns, yes. But he also protected me from despair, when it seemed like there was no justice left in the territory. He protected me from loneliness, when I thought I'd lost everyone who cared about my welfare. And he protected me from becoming the kind of person who gives up fighting for what's right just because the odds seem impossible. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, and the courtroom remained absolutely silent as she spoke from the heart about love that had grown from necessity into something transcendent. If that's not a genuine marriage, then I don't know what genuine means. We chose each other, stood by each other, and risked everything to protect each other. The legal documents were just paperwork. The real marriage happened in a mine shaft when he took a bullet meant for me, and I realized I'd rather die beside him than live without him. The defense attorney had no response to such honesty, and when he sat down without further questions, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Rosalind's testimony had not only exposed the criminal conspiracy, but it also demonstrated the kind of personal courage and integrity the territorial government needed to rebuild itself on honest foundations. The verdicts, when they finally came, were mixed but encouraging. Governor Alistair Camden was convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy and corruption, receiving a 20-year federal prison sentence that effectively ended his political career. Dozens of territorial officials received similar sentences, while others plea bargained for reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. But some of the most important figures in the conspiracy escaped justice through technicalities, destroyed evidence, or simple lack of witnesses willing to testify against powerful enemies. The criminal network was broken, but not entirely eliminated, leaving survivors who would nurse grievances and plan revenge against those who had exposed their activities. The journey back to Wind River Ford after the trials was both triumphant and sobering. They had succeeded in exposing systematic corruption and establishing legal precedents that would protect property rights throughout the expanding West. But they had also made enemies who possessed long memories and considerable resources. It was during this journey home that Chayton finally found the strength to speak about experiences that had been too painful to share during his recovery from Pike's bullet. The wound had healed cleanly under Dr. Price's care, but the emotional scars from their ordeal would take longer to fade. I keep thinking about what Pike said in the mine. He admitted as they made camp beside a stream that reminded them both of happier times. About Crazy Woman Creek and the men who died because he was too coward to lead them. "You're not responsible for his choices," Rosalind replied, understanding that survivors' guilt was part of the price of victory over men like Pike. "You saved his life because it was the right thing to do, not because you endorsed his character or his actions. But if I'd left him to die in that creek bottom, none of this would have happened. Jean-Baptiste would still be alive. You wouldn't have been hunted like an animal, and dozens of people wouldn't have died because of Pike's criminal activities." She took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a life spent protecting others, and looked into eyes that still carried the weight of choices made in impossible circumstances. "If you'd left him to die, you wouldn't be the man I fell in love with," she said simply. "The man who saves people because it's right, not because it's convenient or profitable. The man who taught me that courage isn't about being unafraid, it's about doing what needs to be done, despite the fear." Their conversation continued long into the night, working through the complex emotions that came from surviving experiences that had changed them both in fundamental ways. They were no longer the desperate fugitives who had fled through Devil's Canyon, but they were also no longer the same people who had entered into a marriage of convenience to escape Pike's threats. It was in the aftermath of these conversations, as they finally returned to Wind River Ford to rebuild their life together, that they decided to hold the wedding ceremony they had never really had. Their original marriage had been a hasty arrangement for mutual protection, but now they wanted to celebrate the love that had grown from partnership into something deeper and more lasting than either had thought possible. The ceremony was held the following spring beside the waters of Wind River Ford, when the cottonwoods were green and the water ran clear and strong after winter's ice had melted. Federal Judge Harrison presided over vows that looked toward the future rather than dwelling on the violence and corruption they had overcome, while friends and allies from throughout the territory gathered to celebrate two people who had found something rare and precious in each other. Tasunke served as best man, his own scars from their ordeal healed but not forgotten. His young face bright with happiness at seeing his uncle find the contentment that had eluded him for so many years. Agent Wells, she would always be Beatrice to them, stood as matron of honor, her federal credentials revealed, but her friendship unchanged by the professional deceptions that had been necessary for her undercover work. Dr. Price provided music on a violin that had survived Indian raids and cattle wars to play wedding songs beside a frontier river, while Marshall Hale gave away the bride in place of the father she had never known. Even some of the federal investigators who had worked on the corruption cases attended their presence, a symbol of the bridges that were being built between different communities in territorial Wyoming. But it was the private moment afterward, when Chayton and Rosalind stood alone beside the ford that had given meaning to their lives, that sealed their partnership for whatever challenges the future might bring. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying weight that made all their struggles seem worthwhile. "For everything you are, everything you've done, everything we've built together. And I love you," he replied, his arms encircling her waist as they watched the sun set behind familiar mountains. "Not just for the woman you become, but for the girl who trusted me to keep her safe all those years ago." Their kiss was witnessed only by the flowing water and the evening stars, but it sealed a bond that had been forged in the crucible of territorial politics and tempered by the kind of shared adversity that either destroyed relationships or made them unbreakable. The trading post prospered in the years that followed, serving travelers and settlers who needed supplies or safe passage across the river. Their children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, played beside the same waters where their parents had found each other, growing up in a territory that was slowly but surely being transformed by the rule of law rather than the law of force. Chayton proved to be a natural father, teaching his children to ride and shoot and navigate the complexities of life, in a territory where multiple cultures were learning to coexist. His Lakota heritage provided connections to traditional knowledge about the land and its resources, while his frontier experience offered practical skills for survival in country that could be unforgiving to the unprepared. Rosalind flourished as both a businesswoman and a mother, managing the trading post's operations while also serving on territorial committees that worked to improve education and infrastructure throughout Wyoming. Her testimony during the federal investigations had made her famous throughout the territory. But it was her work building schools and supporting homesteader families that earned her lasting respect. As Wyoming territory moved toward statehood in the 1880s, both found themselves drawn into political activities that extended far beyond their trading post. Their expertise in territorial affairs and their reputation for integrity made them valuable advisors to the Constitutional Convention that would shape Wyoming's government as it prepared for admission to the Union. But it was the legacy they built together, a community founded on mutual respect rather than fear, a business that prospered through fair dealing rather than intimidation, and a marriage that demonstrated the power of love to overcome any obstacle, that truly honored the memory of Jean-Baptiste Tremblay and all the others who had sacrificed to make Wyoming territory a place where freedom and justice were more than just words in political speeches. As autumn painted the cottonwoods in shades of gold and crimson, and the eternal sound of water flowing over Wind River Ford provided peaceful counterpoint to their conversation. Chayton and Rosalind sat on their porch and reflected on the journey that had brought them together. They had weathered storms of violence and corruption, raised a family and country that tested human endurance with every sunrise, and built something that would endure long after their own lives were ended. The water rights to Wind River Ford remained secure. Their marriage had grown stronger with each passing year, and Wyoming Territory was finally ready to take its place as a full member of the United States. But most importantly, they had created a legacy of courage, integrity, and love that would inspire future generations to stand up for justice, even when the odds seemed impossible to overcome.